All right. According to the buttons, we're live. So we're going to wait a couple minutes just to let folks get ready to get tuned in. It is 6:31 according to my watch, but I think StreamYard goes 2 minutes behind. I think we might be there's a slight delay. So far I'm seeing about 15 that are starting to view with us. Greetings, friends and family out there, community members. Guess what? It is Reentry Week. And although every single day we should be thinking about our friends and our family members who are out there in the community who are justice involved. And right, let's talk about that for a second. When we're using words like justice involved, restored citizens, this is a reframing of the language from saying ex-felon, right? Insensitivity regarding language. We have to be really careful about our language and about our words with our family members who happen to have an experience with our justice system where they got caught on their worst day and their worst decision for things that we arguably have probably done ourselves, right? And so if not, but for the grace of God, it could have been us, right? But we have family members who have been impacted in some way by our mass incarceration system. And if you've seen documentaries like 13th, other kinds of footage like that, you know that there's so many complexities with the justice system. And so we are so thrilled and overjoyed during this Reentry Week to be joined by Dr. I want to put other stuff with your name. I want to be like Reverend, Dr., DJ, but maybe not yet. Reuben Jonathan Miller. And if you could, sir, tell us just a little bit about you before we jump into the meat of it all, just so people get an understanding, not just of you, the scholar, the professor, the author, but why this topic is of interest to you.
Sure. Thank you, Kim. I appreciate what you do and all you're doing, and I'm glad to be here. So I wrote a book called Halfway Home, Race, Punishment, and the Afterlife of Mass Incarceration. But for the last, it's based on my research and practice experience over the last 2 decades or so, attending specifically to the last 15 years, where I followed men and women out of jails, prisons, police station lockup facilities, halfway houses, and home. I followed them home. But the reason I did this research, it began as really an ethical commitment to the work. There was a scripture that moved me, Matthew 25. And in that scripture, it says, among other things, when I was naked, did you clothe me? When I was hungry, did you feed me? When I was sick and in prison, did you visit me? And so I asked my pastor if we could start a prison ministry. So we did. And I started doing work as a volunteer chaplain in the Cook County Jail. And I did that for about 5 years, from 2003 to 2008, the height of mass incarceration. And while I was doing that work, I met my father, who had been incarcerated for 20 years. I never met him before. I didn't know that he was incarcerated. I had no idea why, perhaps he was absent, and perhaps he wasn't absent because of incarceration. But it just so happens that he was incarcerated and had been locked up for 20 years. I'd also started graduate school at the time to try to understand why so many people who look like me, people from my neighborhood, I grew up poor and Black after 1972, kept moving in and out of jails and prisons, and specifically the jail where I was, the Cook County Jail, which at the time was the largest single site jail facility in the country. And while I was doing my research as a graduate student, my brother was incarcerated. And so I write the book as a researcher, for sure. I'm trained as a sociologist, but I also write the book as the son and brother of incarcerated and formerly incarcerated men.
And one of the things that I think is, by the way, friends and family out there, you got to check out this book. It's called Halfway Home, right? And I am not just telling you this because we're sitting here with him. Like, pretend he's not there right now. Pretend like Dr. Miller's not there. We need to read this book because it really, I think, does a good job of blending not just, social science, right? Not just research, not just data, but also human being stories. We're talking about sentient beings who are going through these experiences. And what I also really appreciated about your book is there was context, right? We talk about what happens before, what's happening during these experiences, and then the reentry process. And one of the things I wanted to ask you about is, it seemed like there were moments when I was listening to the book. I did Audible, y'all, cheated. But I actually enjoyed it that way. There were moments in listening to the book where it seemed like there was like this tension between you having family members who are going through this experience, people who you might know or build relationships with who have gone through these experiences, but then your social scientist hat. Mm-hmm. How you ask questions. I remember there was one part where you're talking about like how social scientists have to almost not believe you when you're sharing information, but how critically sensitive that kind of notion is for a person who no one's listening to your story.
Absolutely.
And so if you could share a little bit about that experience and then what that was like to utilize that tool, but then to get these stories, and especially hearing it from racialized Black bodies, I would be curious about that.
Yeah, thank you for that. There was a tension between how we're trained in the social sciences, which is to be distant, to put distance between you and your quote research subjects, and what it means to grow up poor and Black in a city like Chicago, in a city like Columbus, in a city like LA, in a city like New York, in a city like any of the cities, or Baton Rouge, or any of the small towns, or any of the suburbs, because we know that poverty is concentrated in suburbs. We know that now rural incarceration rates exceed incarceration rates in the city. So no matter where you grow up, if you grow up poor in this country, especially if you're born poor and Black, into what people might call the mass incarceration generation, you have very little distance between you and this subject, right? So I couldn't avoid the jail or prison if I wanted to, but we're taught to do that. We're taught to distance ourselves from the thing that we're interested in because it lends a kind of objectivity. We're taught to distance ourselves so people don't presume that we have a quote bias. And the things that you learn when you're objective, when you try to presume a distance from the people who you're talking to. And one of the techniques in doing that is to constantly challenge and to check the things that they say, to not presume they're telling you the truth. Another perspective is to treat whatever they say like it is something that they said, that is worth listening to, it's worth respecting in and of itself. But anyway, the things to be learned from taking an objective stance. I mean, you can count things, you can predict things. So it's good to know objectively the numbers and how the numbers lead to this or that thing. So for example, if you want to know, what's the likelihood that somebody's going to get a job, it's good to have some distance and say, well, what are the facts of the matter here? But that doesn't tell me what the world of work looks like. That doesn't tell me how a life is expressed, how a life is experienced. And so I can know that there are 19.6 million people in this country who have a felony record. But that doesn't tell me what it's like to live with one. And I can know that you're less likely to be called back for a job if you're a Black person without a felony record than a white person without a felony record, and that you're almost less likely to be called back for a job if you're a Black person without a felony record than a white person who has one. But I don't know what it looks like to look for that job and to constantly hear no. And I can know that there are boxes that we put on all the applications, and that you have a constitutional right to discriminate against me if I have a criminal record. But I can't know what it feels like in that moment. I can't know how that moment is expressed. I can't know what it's like to have the conversation with the landlord. I can't know what it's like to not be believed when I have something to say. If the person in front of me doesn't believe me, or if the person in front of me isn't even looking for the kinds of dynamic lives I'm able to build for myself, the dynamic life I'm able to build for myself. In fact, one additional point on this. If the person in front of me is only looking at my weaknesses, is only looking at me as a problem, who's not looking at how I make connections, how I managed to get over, how I managed to figure out how to make a grilled cheese sandwich from a jail cell, how I managed to figure out how to feed myself despite being locked out of the labor market, then that person will never know anything about what it's like to live under these conditions. And so I decided to allow myself to get close. I decided to use the tools that I was taught when they were useful, and to hold them at bay when they weren't, in much the same way that they teach us to hold our personalities, our interests, our politics, and all these things at bay when we go into the field, I decided to do that for the method itself so that I could get close enough to see things that maybe people who don't allow themselves to be close aren't quite able to see.
You know, what I love about that and the tension and the hard part about that is, you know, there's a lot going on in the world right now, particularly for people in racialized Black bodies.
That's right.
And one of the things that we've been discussing in a lot of those spaces is that tension between doing the work versus feeling the moral imperative that's underneath the work, right? There's usually a personal reason why folks decide to do what they do, especially when you're touching stuff that hurts. And I really like what you said, and intrigued by how that sits on a lot of folks who are in roles of power and leadership. You know, it's just like, how far do you go to just like, let's just do the work, you know, and how sometimes the work can get stifled when you feel the pain of it.
Yeah.
You know, I want to give a shout out to the folks connected to a lot of what we're doing here. So Arch, to Central Ohio Reentry Week, to Central Ohio Restored Citizens Collaborative. Thank you so much for making this possible. Please let me know who else I'm forgetting, but I want to make sure that I'm honoring those who are doing this work every single day. You know, one of the things, and I'm interested in your thoughts about this, especially as it might relate to what you found when you're listening to the stories, because I'll tell you, there were some of the stories that you're sitting with folks, you know, and I felt like I was in the room with you, and you could just feel the pain of physiological manifestation of just that pain, that hurt, you know, and hearing some of those stories, folks who, for example, if their incarceration was connected to mental health and mood disorders or addictions, or, you know, these kinds of things that, let's be quite honest, in BIPOC communities, we're not frankly talking about or often addressing. And sometimes that leads to it. Well, maybe a couple years ago, also shout out to Franklin County Office of Justice Policy. Thank you so much for you being a part of this. So a couple years ago, we were doing something called Restored Citizens Community Chat Series. And every month we would have a small gathering. This is pre-COVID, a small gathering of folks who were restored citizens or justice involved. And we would have different topics that we would talk about, a person who would come and either share their story, share their resource or whatever. And it didn't matter what the topic was about. Invariably, the thing that ended up surfacing in every single conversation was trauma. Yeah. Every single time. There wasn't one time that we had a conversation and trauma didn't come up. And one of the things that was fascinating in a painful way is how folks, number one, didn't know that they were experiencing trauma when they were in it. How trauma was often the origin point, right? Like there was some hurt that happened before whatever crime ever was committed. Right? That the story started with trauma, that the actual experience of incarceration was traumatic. And then the process of reentering is traumatic. Often perpetually traumatic. And so there's no point where it doesn't hurt. And it didn't hurt. And so I'm interested in what you found in talking with, I'm saying subjects, with the really storytellers and the research you found, and this link between these pain points and this carceral system. And then from your perspective as a researcher, you know, there's this part where it's just like, well, even if we created the most amazing policy in the whole world, does it fix the trauma? This is no, please, you were saying. Well, and I'm just wondering, like, well, what was it like to just hold space with folks when you're there for research perspective, right? And then you get all this trauma filling the space. You know, and then, you know, what are your thoughts about what that looks like? And from all different perspectives, from those who are sitting in power positions, leadership positions, when it's like, there's this stuff, like the logistics and the strategy and the policy. And then there's this pain stuff that, like, how do you respond to that? I just, what are your thoughts?
I think proximity is, for me, it's not, there's no such thing as a silver bullet for all the things that we face. But proximity is also about vulnerability. And so if I allow you to get close to me, the things I have to do, I have to release some of my own guards to allow this proximity that I'm talking about. So to be able to sit with someone who's in pain, I have to be in touch with my own pains. I have to be able to see the pain, recognize the pain, recognize the trauma for what it is, suspend my judgment of the person who acts out of that pain, at least long enough for me to understand what I'm dealing with, what I'm looking at, what I'm hearing, what I'm holding, and allow it to touch me in a deep way. If I'm to express it with the urgency that the moment calls for, or if I'm to express it, more importantly, in any way that resembles what people actually experience from day to day. To tell you a little, to bring us to a story in the book, there's a brother, my dear friend Martin, and this is a part of proximity, where the people you spend time with become your friends because they are your friends. Dear Martin was sexually abused as a child. It's interesting when I talk to men and women, certainly women, we know that women's incarceration rates have grown over the years. The racial disparities decreased a little bit, but the incarceration rate for women has grown alongside men. We know that something like 84% of women who spend time in an American jail or prison have been are survivors of sexual abuse. We know that half of them have been abused as children. So to try to help women who've been incarcerated in any demonstrable way, in any way that's efficacious, rather, we have to wrestle with what it means to be sexually abused. And if you think about sexual abuse, you have to wrestle with what it means to be disbelieved. We know that there's something like 17,000, 19,000, 20,000 untested rape kits in every American city. That's the story for women. Similar things happen to men quite often, but there's no space for men to talk about sexual trauma, for sexual abuse. There's no space for men to be vulnerable, especially not one to another, men to men. We need to create spaces where this is possible. But here's the point about my dear friend Martin. Martin was serially sexually abused when he was a child and ran away in response to that abuse, as many folks do. They run away. But now he's homeless. So first, vulnerable to sexual abuse. Then, as a homeless person, he is completely unprotected. He was a homeless child. He was a runaway at 13 years old. And he lived, this is a story in chapter 2. He slept at night at a newspaper company. This was in the 60s and 70s. He slept at night in a newspaper company. Him and 2 other boys that formed family, something like family. One of those boys was murdered. Martin had nowhere to process that, nowhere to grieve. Martin turns to alcohol. Martin stays homeless. He's homeless for a decade. How do we respond to Martin? We arrest him 14 times for trespassing while he's homeless, grieving multiple trauma and the death of his dear friend. Those are all misdemeanor crimes, but there are 14 of them. Martin's arrested many years later. He had 3 crack rocks in his pocket. The prosecutor says, we're going to charge him with a felony, possession with intent to sell. This is in the early 2000s. This wasn't so long ago. Possession with intent to sell. The judge says, I was at the hearing, that's excessive. Why a felony charge? He says, Your Honor, look at his pattern of criminality. Look at these 14 arrests for nothing that we now use as evidence. These 14 arrests because Martin was homeless, because Martin was running away from trauma and violence, because he was coping with his problems in the best way that he knew how. And in response to his coping strategy, including smoking a rock, by the way, in response to his coping strategy, we arrest him. That was the year that Martin got the first felony conviction of his lifetime. Thankfully, Martin has found a way home. He began doing volunteer work with other formerly incarcerated men, but especially with men who experienced homelessness. He started a ministry in the name of his late father. He went and handed out food, and he got donations for that ministry. He put himself through truck driving school because he found real purpose in that ministry, real drive in that ministry. Like many formerly incarcerated men and women across this country, do they find real purpose, real drive in their ability to give back to their community? But he had to do all of this. This extraordinary man who finished truck driving school, who finished an associate's degree in college, who connected with a family who had given up on him and reconnected with them. This extraordinary man was able to do that through sheer muscle and willpower and through a kernel of faith that he developed through all those hard times, a kind of resilience. But he's extraordinary. And this extraordinary man, we responded to his need through incarceration. Our problem is that when we see trauma expressed, we respond with punishment. One other note, and this isn't from my research, it's from my dear friend, Professor Desmond Patton from Columbia University. Professor Patton studies shooters, and he studies their Twitter activity. He was the first person to find, studying Twitter and the young shooters who use it, that almost without exception, the young people in his sample who went out and shot somebody else expressed pain and grief before they went out and picked up that gun. How do we respond? Police scrub that data too, and they send police cars to arrest them. How could we respond? We could see trauma. We could see pain. We could see grief. And we could respond with care, with love, with compassion. But that requires us to get close, because if I respond to you with care and love and compassion, and you're somebody who I'm afraid of, I might get hurt. That's true. But if I don't take this step of vulnerability, this step to get close to you, me, us, people who look like me, my sons, people who look like my children, people who look like my family, my brothers, my father, it's very personal for me. If we don't take this step, we'll never find our way out of this mess.
You know, we have all kinds of spaces of leaders that are meeting on a regular basis around the world, particularly around the nation, especially with things that are being experienced inside of communities, dealing with poverty, abject poverty, and then dealing with, we know, systemic racism. And one of the things that I think is challenging, and you just touched on it, is, you know, in some cultural spaces, we talk about the philosophy of Ubuntu. I'm a person through the existence of other people, and feeling the connectedness. Mm-hmm. And I wonder, you know, about, to your point, what it looks like then if leaders were to believe you're connected to the people who you serve.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. How does that change your work?
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, how does it change systems? How does that change how you design processes and practices and procedures?
Yeah.
How might it change how slow or fast the system works? How might it change fee structures?
Yeah.
How might it change visitation policies? How might it change, you know, and all the way when it dwindles down all to these finest points? And to your point, as it relates to like the connection between emotion and behavior and what we do, there was a line, there's all these different things. I was like, oh, that's good. I'm always like trying to write down the quotable quotes, right? And there was a line, and I believe it came from inside the book. I believe it was Ronald Simpson Bay who said it. And there he said, when I stopped being angry, I looked up. Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. But the reason why this stood out, for a bazillion reasons, but one of the reasons why it stood out to me is anger is never the first emotion. Mm. Right. And to the point that you mentioned before, there's all these other things that folks feel first. How much did we miss in folks' trauma stories before we got to the anger? Because sometimes the anger is where then the next thing happens, which then leads to incarceration. But like, did we catch it before it got to the anger?
And that's the anger in them. I mean, there's also the anger in us that you would dare break the law. You would dare break a law. I'm going to give you 50 years. Ronald Simpson Bay got 50 years Ronald Simpson Bay is my dear brother and my dear friend. My dear brother and friend did 27 years on wrongful conviction because he got himself out of prison. He advocated for himself. He became a jailhouse lawyer, but he was sentenced for 50 years, not only for a crime he did not commit, but for supposedly shooting at a police officer who had a tissue wound. Brother Ronald was not at the scene of the crime. when this happened, but it didn't matter. You know, the court proceedings, stuff like that. You all can read the book and find out more. Actually, you can talk to him. He's one of the leading activists in the country on this question on the question of criminal justice reform. Anyway, but there's an anger in us that we have to really deal with, an impulse to punish. You know, what is it? What is it that's seeking retribution by doling out pain? Why is prison the first response to a whole host of problems that range from addiction to murder? A scholar who I had the chance to have a conversation with, who works at ASU, Abby, I'll remember her last name, asked me that question. You know, why is the prison this response? And it's such a powerful question to think about. You know, everybody from people who committed a property crime to people who committed who went on a killing spree, and that our response is this one size fits all response. It's the prison to varying degrees. It's to separate people from their freedom. This is our response. It gives us satisfaction. James Baldwin famously said, you know, it seems at this hour that the sight of chains on black flesh will cause us to rise up and rip off the manacles. But no, we count our safety in chains and corpses. This is where I get the title of chapter 6 from that line. We count our safety in chains and corpses. This is a problem. We have to ask ourselves about our own impulse to punish. But I wanted to address the first round of questions that you raised, which were about what if people believed they were connected, that our fates were, we were in this thing together. But the truth of the matter is that we are. So while 49% of black boys will be arrested by the time they turn 23, and I say boys because 23, you're a man, but barely, right? Like you haven't yet lived, you haven't even filled out your body yet, right? You're not there yet. 38% of white boys will be arrested before they turn the age of 23 in this country. While there are over 900,000 black prisoners in an American jail or prison in this country, there are nearly 900,000 white American men and women, white people in American jail or prison. In fact, while 1 in 44% roughly of black women have are currently incarcerated loved ones, so do 1 in 8 white women have a currently incarcerated loved one. And depending on where you live, if you go to California, those prisons are filled with the poor. They're filled with folks from Laos. They're filled with folks from Vietnam. They're filled with, you see what I'm saying? They're filled with Filipinos. They're filled with Latinx folks. It depends on where you are. The group that is cast out, that is cast away, that is put beneath. These are the groups that we see in American jail and prison. In fact, Baldwin also says, if you want to know if there's any love for justice, ask a black or a Puerto Rican. Ask somebody who's been to that joint. And they'll tell you not whether or not a country is just, but whether or not it has any conception of what justice is or any love for it. But the point that I'm trying to raise here is we are connected to it. Disproportionately black and brown people, disproportionately black people, overwhelmingly over and against all the other groups, with indigenous Americans following closely behind it in regard to incarceration, but leading us when it comes to murder at the hands of police officers, for example. We don't think about them at all. We've erased them out of our minds. But even with the egregious racial disparity, we can't pretend like systemic racism doesn't exist. We can't pretend like racism isn't a real thing in this country. We can't pretend like black folks don't get the hammer. But even with that being the case, we live in a country where 1 in 2 Americans have a loved one who's ever been to a jail or prison. This is the world that we've built, and we can't see it because of how racism works. Racism works in this way. One way racism works is that it prevents me from getting a job because of my last name. Black sounding last names, the research says, leads to lower access to employment. Okay, so that's one way. Another way American racism works is by fooling us, linking blackness with criminality so tightly that when we say the word mass incarceration, we only think it's about black people. When we say the word mass incarceration, we don't think it affects us, however the us is defined. When we say the word mass incarceration, we forget about that nearly 1 million white men in that American jail or prison right now. When we say the word mass incarceration, we don't think that 1 and 2 of our families are locked away. We think mass incarceration stops at the threshold of the Black family, but the truth of the matter is, and go into any American prison, and you'll see this. You'll see plenty white folks in prison. In fact, if you released every Black person today, Marie Gottschalk, a political scientist, says this, if you release every Black person today, we still have one of the world's largest prisons. If you let them all go free. But we think, because of how racism works, that mass incarceration stops at the threshold of the Black family, and it does not. It does not.
You know, what this reminds me of, and I'm going to bring this up again when we bring our panelists in here, is this notion. I was on a call with Black Pac, and this was maybe a year ago. I don't know when. And the topic of citizenship came up, right? But on a deeper level, like, what does it actually mean to be a citizen? What does it mean to actually belong to the country?
That's right. That's right.
And for what some of the things you were just saying, like, think about how many folks feel, and I've heard these kinds of conversations across the board in all kinds of different groups. Do you get the full experience of citizenship in certain bodies? That's
right. That's absolutely right. You know, the book kind of hinges on this idea. In some academic papers, I write about something I call carceral citizenship, which I argue is an alternate form of citizenship that gets activated at the moment of an accusation of a crime, not even prosecution, not even conviction, but at the moment that one is accused of a crime, because I can begin to marshal forces in your direction. Once I think a neighborhood is a so-called hotspot, I can produce a veritable police state in that neighborhood. I can create $1 million block because I think that block is hot. Then I can arrest people over and over and over again. Then I can use that pattern of arrest to say that they are actually criminal. They are the kind of person that is unrehabilitatable, right? Like they. But anyway, but this question of citizenship. So in the framework, you know, citizenship for me, the way I defined it is rights, restrictions, responsibilities, and benefits. And I argue in the book that mass incarceration, we've thought mass incarceration has been a problem of criminal behavior, but really mass incarceration is about citizenship, because at the end of the day, citizenship is about belonging. And the question is whether or not people belong. Well, how can you belong when there are 45,000 laws, policies, and administrative sanctions that target you and people like you? How can you belong where the world that tells you you pull your value from your ability to produce a check, from your labor, from the money you make, your income, from your work, the world that tells you your value comes from work. In that same world, there are 19,000 labor market restrictions. In my state, Illinois, there are 500 employment regulations. If you include occupational licenses and business licenses, there are 960. That's one state. In the state of Illinois, one state. You couldn't groom a dog a few years ago if you had a felony record. In the state of Illinois, you couldn't be a barber until the passage of a congressional act in 2016 that amended the barber and cosmetology licensing law. So what we've done is we've produced a world in which people do not belong. We've produced a world in which people are excluded from civic participation. Right. So when we think about places where we need change in the fact that probably about 30 states in the union don't allow people with criminal records to sit on a jury. So what does that mean? That means when you go before the jury, you're never being tried by a jury of your peers. No one ever has this experience. They don't understand you. So they're looking at you and they're saying, yo, like, this guy, he's committed this act. How could he? I don't get it. I don't understand it. This representation matters in interesting ways. But we've created a world in which people don't belong. That's through law and policy. That's through housing policy, public housing. You can get kicked out of public housing. A good brother, Jimmy, who I met and who I followed through chapter 3, had two very important women in his life. His girlfriend, Cynthia, who was with him through 8 years that he spent in the penitentiary, and his mother, Ruth. Well, when he got out the pen, he told me he no longer wanted to be with Cynthia. He said he wanted a hot girl. This is what he said, right? Like, he was free man. He wanted to, quote, feel free. This is what he said. And okay, so Jimmy, people make all kinds of decisions for all kinds of reasons. It's not my business. So we're just talking. Like this is my job is just to like get to know Jimmy. I'm just trying to get to know Jimmy. And so I ran into him later, and Cynthia had gotten sick. She had a stroke, so much so that she had to go to a nursing home. And the reason why he said he wanted him a hot girl is because she was older than him. She was about 15 years his senior, and he was in his late 40s. And she had a stroke, and she had to go to a nursing home. And I ran into him. I asked him, Jimmy, what's up with Cynthia? How's she doing? How you doing? And he told me they were trying to get married. And I asked him why. He said, well, she was there with me in prison. I'm going to be there with her now. I owe her. So that's a sense of moral obligation. I have no judgment of that. Like, we make all kinds of the relationship decisions all we can. But then in a moment of honesty and introspection, he told me, I feel needy. I said, why, Jimmy? Well, he couldn't rent an apartment. He was sleeping in and out of buildings that were being rehabbed. He was doing rehab work for his old dope dealer that became a real estate developer. And Cynthia was the only place that he could stay. And so he needed Cynthia. And so he told me he stayed with her in part because he needed her, because there was nowhere that would rent him an apartment. That's part A. So I asked, what about your mother, Ruth? He told me he stays away from Ruth. I said, why do you stay away from your mother? Your mother loves you. I happen to get to know Ruth a little bit. Ruth loved Jimmy very much and always offered a place for him to stay. But Ruth's landlord told her that if you let Jimmy come back around here, I'm going to evict you. And so Jimmy stayed in a relationship with a woman he wasn't attracted to. He wanted him a hot girl. That's what he said. Relationship he wanted to end. This is what he told me. Now, I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm telling you what he said. And stayed away from the woman who offered him unconditional love and support because he, quote, I don't want to put her in that position, end quote, because he knows that his mama going to do what mamas do. She's going to let him sleep on the couch. And he knows that landlord's going to do what landlord's going to do, and his mother's going to be evicted. This is the expression of citizenship in the carceral age. And so what we've done in our criminal justice reforms is we thought about things like sentencing lease. We've thought about things about like whether or not somebody can get access to a bus card. We thought about things for mostly non-violent, non-sexual offenders, where we can think about expungement after 7, 8, 10 years, if you stay free from crime and stuff like that, for non-violent, non-sexual offenders. But half the prison went to prison for a violent offense. And what we haven't thought about are these laws, policies, and sanctions that prevent people from ever having a space in the social world, from ever participating in the free world in ways that they found meaningful before they went in.
Thank you so much for that. So many points, and it's reminding me of so many stories that we heard, especially in the work that we do through groups that I mentioned, Franklin County Office of Justice Policy, Central Harbor Store Citizens Collaborative, Arch, other groups that are doing amazing work in community, particularly hands-on reentry work, right? And as we get ready to bring our panelists in, something for us to think about. When we use words like restored citizens, what we're talking about restored, like recreating the narrative. I get to recreate the story about who I am, my relationship, but I also think about when we're talking about citizenship, whether it's fractured or percentaged out belongingness to the country, like everyone doesn't belong at 100%. And depending on what has happened, what your story has included, that might get diminished capacity, a percentage of belongingness to the country, diminished capacity of belongingness to this concept, this great experiment of citizenship. And when I think about some of my friends who are much closer to the granular steps of the reentry process, right? Who are trying to support folks who you just came out, you are walking off of a Greyhound bus, or you're just on the other side of the gate. You don't really have transportation. You don't really have money. Maybe in just some forward thinking knowledge, if your time served was linked to the wrong circle, and you had the foresight to say, please don't send me back home because I'm gonna get in trouble again, then you're being released in a community you know nothing about. You don't know anybody. You don't know anything. You don't know where the resources are. But then based on this, you might have a 12-step meeting you got to go to as soon as possible, somebody you got to report to as soon as possible. You're hungry. You don't have any clothes. You don't have no shoes. You don't have any ID, but you're expected to get a job as soon as possible. Some places we have had folks who talked about having a family member who is upstanding, great, in the community, and they can't live with them because, well, you live in a neighborhood where there are too many people with felonies. So I can't live with the most responsible person who could speak value into my life because they happen to not want to live in a neighborhood, where they wanted to live in a place where they could see themselves, see the community. And that neighborhood happens to be, populated by many people who had a background. And let's be completely honest, what that also might mean is you might have a whole zip code of folks who have been living in epigenetic trauma, right? So we just see this growing. You still got to figure out how to get a job. You don't have transportation. You got to report. You got to try to get interviews. You go into job fairs. You may not have internet access. You might be restricted from internet access. You might be restricted from being able to hang out with friends or family members. You can't go to Cedar Point because you got to report if you leave the county. You can't go to the family reunion because your uncle's got a felony and you can't be around anyone with a felony. You might have, if you get shelter, right? If you're trying to get in the homeless shelter, but you look like a church and lets you use the phone, you can't get in the shelter. It's like, this is the system as it is right now. Belong where?
Yeah. It's a policy of rejection, a policy of exclusion. And this is something that can be fixed. We have 45,000 laws, policies, and sanctions. We have over 1,000 in most states. Do we need 1,000 in most states? This is the question for us.
Mm-hmm. So at this point, I want to bring in our people who are joining us. Officially they're panelists, but I want to just say these are our people who we're going to be in conversation with, and these are these phenomenal sentient beings who have stories and thoughts and positions and voices of power that are connected to this. So as I'm adding them in, we have Councilmember Shayla Fletcher, who's joining our stream. We have Commissioner Brown, who's joining our stream. And we have Mujeddid Muhammad, who's joining our stream as well. Greetings, awesome and amazing human beings. I am so glad that we're all here. And the first thing that I'd like for us to speak to together is this notion, this experiment, this great experiment of citizenship here in this country. What are your thoughts from your lens? And actually, let me back up. I'd like you all to, if you could, share who you are, what you do. So that folks who are tuning in, hey, friends and family out there, if you are just tuning in YouTube world, in Facebook world, thank you so much for joining us. We are having a conversation about the book Halfway Home with Dr. Reuben J Miller, and dynamic conversation. You know what I love, what I'm so happy about Dr. Miller, is you could have come on here and been very and these are facts and these are figures. But it's clear that you are very passionate about this, which makes me happy, because it would have been awkward for me if you weren't, right? But I'm also grateful for those who are on here because I believe we're all passionate about human beings, particularly in this country, in this state, in this city, and so if you could, Mujeddid, Commissioner Brown, Councilmember Fletcher, if you could share who you are, what you do, but why this topic and why right now, why this is important to talk about. And then we'll jump into the meat some more. If we'll start with, as I'm looking at my screen, we'll start with Councilmember Fletcher, and then we'll go to Commissioner Brown, and then we'll go to Mujeddid, and then I'm going to have a follow-up question. And Mujeddid, I'm going to start with you with that follow-up. All right.
Well, good evening. This has been a riveting conversation. I have truly enjoyed listening to the two of you, quite frankly, I could have sat backstage and just let the two of you continue talking, but here we are. So I'm honored to be here this evening. My name is Shayla Fletcher. I serve as a member of Columbus City Council. I'm an attorney by trade. And as a member of Columbus City Council, I chair our housing, public service and transportation, as well as criminal justice and judiciary committees. And so this topic for me, when you think about the intersection of all three of those committees, they fit right in my passion to really elevate the conversation around reentry, right? The theme, I won't say it's the theme, but one thing that we have been saying is I am reentry. And, Dr. Miller, you said something along the lines of this need to have a connection to the work, right? And if we're thinking about leaders who are in our legislative spaces, and it behooves me that one needs to have that that connection in order to understand how important, how pressing certain issues are. I was watching the press conference this morning of one of the latest shootings, and Eric Garner's mom was on just providing some commentary, some remarks, and she employed for people to not have sympathy, but to have empathy, to put themselves in this family's shoes. And it takes my breath away that over and over, and Columbus is not unique, we are facing another crisis in Columbus right now, that over and over, often Black and brown people are having to make that plea to legislators, those in power, to see us, right? And it's the criminalization of Black bodies, of brown bodies, that continues to compound this issue. But when you think about it in the space of those who are returning home, right? I want to be a part of this conversation because I want to give them that due respect. If it only by the grace of God, right? It's not me, it's not my family or what have you, but I don't need to have that connection to understand the importance, the fact that this is a citizen of this country, right? You are residents of Columbus, Ohio, of Franklin County, Ohio. So as a legislator, as a human being, let me do what I can do to liberate, to elevate, to help you in any way I can. So I'm sorry, that was a long answer, but I just was really thinking about some of the thoughts that you all were throwing out there. And that really does drive my passion for this topic.
Thank you so much, Councilmember Fletcher. Commissioner Brown. I think you're muted, but only momentarily. There we go.
Know this, I've been doing Zooms and other forms of communication for a year and a half. Thank you so much. I appreciate the comments before from Dr. Miller. Appreciate my colleague Shayla Fletcher, and I am a social justice advocate, have been for 30 some years. And the reason that this topic is so resonant for me is because of the work I've done in the prisons and jail over time. And I do feel connected to those I've worked with. And because I know that when people do get out, they are my neighbors, and I tell them that. They are my neighbors, they are our constituents, and I believe that with all my heart. And we have a responsibility to do everything we can to help people. I wish they weren't there in the first place, and many of them never belonged there in the first place, but they're there. And when they get out, I believe we have an absolute responsibility to do everything in our power to break down and help them break down whatever barriers we can, and help to get people connected to whatever resources that we can that meet their needs, and to ask the questions, what do you need, rather than prescribe what we think people need. And, we've been doing this work in my office and in the office that got formed from the work that my office has done over the last 10 years, the Justice Policy and Programs Office. And we have peer supports, we have all kinds of help, but it takes a village. It truly does. And, we've had some measures of success that are phenomenal. We've had some that aren't successful, but we keep trying. And you cannot say that anybody that's been incarcerated shouldn't get a chance once they get out. And we don't want people in who don't belong in the first place. And we're doing whatever we can to keep those with mental health issues, those with drug addiction, out of the criminal justice system to begin with, because we know the cascading effects that has.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Brown. Mujeddid.
Good evening, everybody. And I am definitely grateful to be a part of this distinguished panel tonight. My name is Mujeddid Muhammad. I am a restored citizen myself. I was incarcerated for 27 years. I've been home now for a little over 3 years. I currently work at Impact Community Action as a program instructor. I've been there for almost 3 years, 2 years and about 6 months. And what resonates to me about what we're talking about, Dr. Miller, is, many of the things you've shared tonight have been my life. Many of the things you've shared are my life. And, during my incarceration, I've met many men who share those similar backgrounds, particularly when we talk about trauma. I myself was sexually abused at the age of 9 years old. And it subsequently led me down a self-destructive path to where, I've spent well over 30 years in prison. And it wasn't until I was about, 25 that I started coming into an understanding of what was really going on with me. I think Kim talked about how many men have experienced trauma, but don't know what that trauma looks like in their lives, even though everything is falling apart around them. Everything they touch, they're destroying, but they don't understand why that is happening, and that coupled with the fact of us being within a system that doesn't care about that trauma, and a system that's designed to basically contain us in these prisons, in these warehouses, it doesn't make things any better that we're in a system like that and no one is recognizing the trauma. There's not an environment set up where individuals, like you said, can be vulnerable, and talk about that and begin the process of healing, right? So I think this is it's a very important subject. As I listen to you, many of the things that Dr. Michelle Alexander talked about, because her book was the first eye-opening to me about where we're at now with this mass incarceration, and the Jim Crow Esquire type of environment that we're in that many people don't recognize. You know, one of my teachers said that if you don't understand what was, you will not understand what is. And if you don't understand what is, you'll be ill prepared for what is yet to come. And I think that's where we stand at today, right? Is not really knowing the mechanics of what's driving these forces that we're dealing with, you know. But I like the fact that we're having these conversations, we're putting it on people's mind, and we're creating these action plans to make a change.
So thank you so much, all of our panelists, all of our guests. One of the things that I remember hearing, it just echoed in my spirit from the book, Dr. Miller, is, and I believe, hopefully I don't get this wrong, I think it was Daniel's story. The line was, stories of doing time, release, and then dying. Think about that for a second. Stories of doing time, release, and then dying. And then one person, was it, I think it was referenced as Orlando Patterson, talked about a social death or to be socially dead. And I think about that, right? And how many times in some of our chat series when people were just like, I had a whole life before this and I have somehow become invisible, either invisible or magnified 1,000 times, to the point where like my life to some degree is stifled. Like whoever I was, I can't be. So when I think about that phrase, social death, or then to do the time to be released and then to die, like I'm just waiting. Like there's nothing that I can do. All the aspirational goals are gone, right? So in thinking about that phrase, it just sat with me and just ached in my spirit and haunted me a little bit. Just like, what is the answer to that? You know, how do you give hope to that experience when so many, that is their lived experience, right? And what is not fair is to try to find specific examples of people to say, well, this person, that's their real experience too. Many folks' real experience. And in fact, probably so many more, because that's just the one that we heard. How many folks felt like my voice has been made to be so invisible or to count so little that I haven't even shared the story, right? So to that extent, Mujeddid, I wanted to go to you because, and I'm cheating a little bit because I know Mujeddid, right? And I know Mujeddid's story. But one of the things that's fascinating to me about Mujeddid's story is that somehow in your experience, it's almost like you were like dead before the experience and you came to life in your incarceration experience and you decided to do something different. Like when you hit your turning point, everything just started moving where you're like, okay, I've got to do this time a different way. I'm going to educate myself. I'm going to learn more about this trauma thing. ACEs, we talk about adverse childhood experiences. I'm going to see the connectivity between that. I'm going to advocate for myself. And at the point that I come out, I'm going to use the story and champion my story for many, many others who have stories like mine. And I'm interested in you speaking a little bit to that, Mujeddid, about how, what do you think it needs to look like for more people to not feel like, for systems, right? What would our systems better be functioning like? What resources would need to be available for more people to feel like they could come to life after the experience versus waiting to just be released and die, rather than waiting for the social death? What would need to be so based on what you experienced, or what should be so, whatever you want to build, whatever you believe leaders, not unlike Commissioner Brown or Councilmember Favor or others, researchers like Dr. Miller, advocates and activists in the community, what must be so based on your perspective for there to be less social death after this experience and more a renewal of life, more of a reimagining of things, more of a recreation of a narrative after incarceration?
Well, you know, one of the phrases that I came across in my studies was trauma not transformed is transferred. Hurt people hurt people, you know. So, I mean, this trauma piece is so great, right? But the system that we live in does not recognize it. You know, that's what was mind-boggling to me, is that we live in a system that does not recognize how powerful trauma is on the lives of individuals. You know, some of the recent studies that have come out since the adverse childhood experiences studies talk about brain science and how, you know, once the brain has been impacted by trauma, especially during the childhood years or the adolescent years, it creates a state of arrested development. So a lot of individuals that you're dealing with have been living in that state, and it could be generational trauma that they're also dealing with, right? But they're living in that state, right? And they're growing up in that state. And the science says that you become stuck after a while, you know, when you're not able to process all of those traumatizing experiences, you become stuck. So we look at them, the system that is, and we look at them as throwaways, right? Because our system doesn't recognize trauma and it doesn't seek to treat trauma, right? And I think that's the number one problem, is that we have to recognize that trauma is real, and then we have to begin to create learning environments where individuals can be vulnerable. During my incarceration, as I began my healing process, I started to facilitate classes, and I would start out sharing my story, right? And sometimes, you know, because I would hit pockets of pain that I still hadn't touched yet. But as I start sharing my story, you know, others would begin opening up about theirs because they admire my courage to be able to just put that out there in the opening like that, right? So what we need is to facilitate healing. That's what our system needs. We need a system that recognizes trauma and seeks to set up environments that will help in the facilitation of healing. So what I got from the first quote that I said, and this is what I now represent, is trauma transformed is healing transferred. Heal people, help people. And that's the movement that I'm now representing, you know, in my nonprofit. I've started a nonprofit to help those that are transitioning out of prison, to help them reacclimate to society and not be a perpetual victim of the trauma that they hold within, right? So that's one of the things that I'm seeking to do.
Thank you so much for that, Mujeddid. Dr. Miller, I'm going to go to you, and then I'm going to go to Councilmember Favor and Commissioner Brown on this. I'm curious, based on your research, based on the stories that you heard from folks, where have you seen systems get this right? I remember there was one example you talked about, a prison where they changed all kinds of policies. They did a certain kind of dispense of, money with ATMs. They changed they changed all these kinds of things, and then it made the system work better. Where have you seen systems make improvements that seem to support versus hinder the process? Because we saw it in one of the comments, and I have to go back to see who said it, but a shout out to somebody who said, like, sometimes these very processes actually exacerbate the trauma.
Exactly.
Right? You made it a million times worse in this thing that didn't rehabilitate anybody, right? Yeah. This correction corrected nothing, right? And so where have you seen in your research or in the stories, this actually, exemplars of where this actually is a best practice? This is something we should pay attention to that is duplicable to get this right.
Well, I'd like to point attention to a couple things. So one is, that services are good. That service, like, people need services. I don't know that you can lock a man or a woman in a cage for a decade or 3 or 5 or 8 or 6 years or 6 months or 90 days, and they not need help and support in recovering from that. That taking away someone's freedom is traumatic. And then you introduce, once you've taken their freedom, restrictions on the freedom of their movement, restrictions we've talked about, the inability to collaborate with colleagues, the inability to associate with, quote, known offenders, meaning you have to cut off ties from your bunkies, cellies, rappies, people who helped you get through the last 2 decades the last decade. You have to say, no, we can't talk until you get off probation or parole or something like that. It's the most ridiculous thing in the world. We expect people to be mountains of men and women, to be able to do things and go at it alone. It's silly. And then we respond to them. I mean, it really is silly. It really is silly. And then we respond to them. Our response to them is only psychological, interpersonal. It's only behavioral. And so the psychological interpersonal is so important because it helps men reconnect with family and their loved ones. It's so necessary. It's so necessary to help folks get over the bad parts. But what we lack is a language of protection. We lack a language of protection. We have a language of service, which services are important. They relieve real human suffering in real time. An organization that I spent time with that I call Emmaus in the book, but there are a million. Let me name a real one. So there's an organization called St. Leonard's Ministries. It's just a beautiful organization in Chicago. And what they do is they provide food, clothing, shelter, counseling. They connect with a university. They connect with the Erickson Institute to provide weekly counseling. They do psychotherapy groups. And they do this really interesting thing where they act as bridges. So they go out to resource rich institutions like landlord associations, jobs at like universities, hospitals, and this kind of thing. And what they do is they send out a job broker. And the research shows that when you connect resource poor people to resource rich institutions, when you act as a bridge, when you say, this guy is good, he's been through my program, take a risk on them, they get jobs, they stay stable. When you go out and you put your name on them and you say, yo, like we trust him, rent him a house, that he'll get the house rented. There've been independent evaluations of this specific organization. It's a wonderful organization. There've been independent evaluations of job brokers and housing brokers. So the bridge, resource rich institutions connected to resource poor people lead to better outcomes. So that's things that we know from the evidence base, the quote best practices, this kind of thing. But in all of this, we lack a language of protection. And so what we don't do. So for the 40 men that are able to get through Emmaus's doors and not sleep on the couch, to get the 40 beds that are available, there's 700 applications. And what we do is we prepare them, those 40 people, for the worlds of work. And we make a nice path for them, those 40 people at a time, a couple hundred people in a given year. And they've expanded their capacity and all these sorts of things. But what we don't do is we don't prepare the worlds of work for them. Because we don't protect them. We don't believe that they're vulnerable. We think they're risk. We think they're dangerous. And so in all our discussions, not in this one, but I'm saying like in the policy discussions, there are programs that teach men how to keep an apartment once they get it. But there are very few programs that help men get the apartment. There are very few programs that will suspend the ability of the landlord to look at that felony record, especially if it's a violent felony, and say, you must house them. And we know, for example, that housing insecurity leads to crime. We know that lack of employment leads to crime. We know that civic participation reduces crime. We know that education reduces crime by something like 67%, yet we still gutted the Pell Grant. We reinstated it very recently. So the point I'm trying to raise is, it is not pie in the sky stuff to be talking about systems and structure, while at the same time, we talk about interpersonal change and transformation. These two things have to go together, or you have one thing that happens without the other. And then what you end up having is really exceptional men and women who are able to change and transform their individual lives and do very well and help a million other people. I'm thinking about our brother Muhammad's work. Man, that's powerful, important, incredible. I want to see 1 million brother Muhammads. There are 2 million prisoners. I want to see 2 million brother Muhammads. Like, this is the point. And our thinking is a systems thinking because we don't have a framework of protections. So I want to throw that in the air. I want to put that out, that policymakers need to think about people with criminal records like they think about everyone else. If there are protections in the labor market for everyone else, there should be protection in the labor market for people with criminal records. But we don't see that. We see people with criminal records tearing down homes that have asbestos in it with no protective gear and no ability to sue under workman's comp law. You see what I'm saying? The framing. I'm talking too long. I'm gonna shut up. But the entire framing has to change. We have to. This is the vulnerability point, because someone with a criminal record might engage in a crime later. That happens because people engage in crime. Is what happens. We have to be willing to take the risk to move away from the ways that we've constructed safety in policy making, in program planning. Then all the interpersonal deep work that we do can happen in much more powerful ways.
I want to pull, hold on a second. We got so much good stuff happening. Thank you to all of those too who are populating the chat. Please keep talking. If you have questions, make sure you put them in the chat. We are paying attention if you're watching out there on Facebook and on YouTube. So if you have questions or comments or thoughts, please keep talking, and we will make sure that we get your feedback directed so that folks know that we hear you and we're listening. So for Councilmember Favor and for Commissioner Brown, I wanted to get your thoughts on what Dr. Miller has shared, especially through the lens of your leadership seats. And I want to modify it though slightly for you, and in that, and I can say this because I don't have your leadership levels, so I can say stuff, right? And that is, I don't know that you can say this out loud, but I'm sure that there are moments where, because you are sensitive to these kinds of stories, you probably have some colleagues, or have had at some point some colleagues, who don't necessarily feel as personally moved by a Dr. Miller or by a Mujeddid. And that means then there might be some times when your role as leaders is it really, sometimes has to be braver than one might expect, more courageous than one might expect, lonelier than one might expect. I throw this word out here, trailblazer. It's not a glamorous thing to be a trailblazer. It's a pretty excruciating, painful thing to be a trailblazer, because you're often doing things and people don't see your vision or your insight or what you want to, the change that you want to make. And so in responding to this, I'm asking you to also think about what is so or what could be so, but also understanding that some of these things that we want to change, in full disclosure, I mean, especially if we've seen movies like 13, some of this stuff disrupts things that are working out pretty great for people who are in positions of power. Right? And to make changes that make life better for many of the people that Dr. Miller spoke of in his book disrupts life for people who are pretty comfortable right now. So what is being done? What can we do? What does it call for, especially in positions when folks have leadership roles? You know, what are we doing? What can we do? What must we do?
So if I can just stay in the same vein that Dr. Miller led us on around housing. A few months ago, I embarked on an initiative to really start tackling our housing crisis in Columbus. Not only do we have a housing crisis, but we also have an eviction crisis. And by way of some of the CARES Act dollars that the city of Columbus received, we were able very quickly to set up a tenant-based rental assistance program that provided emergency rental dollars to folks right there on the spot through the help of Impact. Shout out to Mr. Mohammed for his work at Impact. And then also to provide legal assistance, because we know when folks have attorneys in court, they are less likely to be evicted on the spot. But this work is truly informed by the history of housing. And Kim, you know how passionate I am when we start talking about redlining and gentrification and how our communities, our cities, our suburbs came to be in this country, much of which many people are uneducated about. And so when you ask what needs to happen, as legislators, my role is to not only just legislate, but is in part to educate. And so I embarked on this effort to create new legislation around housing. If I can't build housing physically myself right now, and obviously because of the pandemic, things have slowed down, well, what can I do to change policy, to put measures in place, other protections in place to ensure that those who are likely to face a housing crisis, whether it's by COVID, whether it's from re-entering back into society, or a whole nother host of factors, that they have issues in place, legislation in place to protect them. So very quickly, rental receipt, it ensures that if you pay your rent with cash or a money order, then you get a receipt. It seems like it's common sense, but the reality is that it's not a law, right? And so many of our low-income folks are unbanked. And so when it comes time to battle in court whether or not you paid rent, you didn't have anything. The second thing is called renter's choice. We know that because people are very quickly trying to find new spaces to live in, that security deposit can be a true obstacle. They will have the first month's rent. They could have the last month's rent, but you have an additional $1,000 or whatever it may be on the spot. What this law does is it splits that security deposit up and provides options for the tenant at that time. But the one that is so important to this conversation is source of income discrimination. And when I'm thinking about folks who are experiencing either homelessness, they're re-entering back into society, they may be on Section 8, or they may be receiving a housing choice voucher. We know that source of income discrimination is a proxy for race discrimination, and so on and so forth. And so in the city of Columbus now, you cannot deny someone housing based on their source of income. Where in the past, you could just say, you know what, no vouchers here, no Section 8 here, no returning citizens here, any of that you could say. But now that is no longer the case. And in order to be able to get to the place where we could pass that legislation, it took months of community conversations, public hearings, conversations with the landlord community, conversations with stakeholders, our new American communities, to the point where I did not think it would take that long. But I understand that if we are going to be change agents, part of that change agency must be education as well. And I can't expect people to know everything that I know. We could talk about that at a different time, but it is important for me to talk about the issues that folks returning home are facing, right? Folks experiencing homelessness are facing, Black and brown people are experiencing as it relates to housing. And then in the words of Mr. Miller, you know, in the spirit of protections, craft legislation that has those protections in place, and not just protections, but it's uplifting, right? It's providing them that opportunity, that platform to be able to get back to where they want to be. So we're not there all the way, but just making strides along the way.
And I would agree with Councilwoman Favor on the housing issues, but I would also go to employment. And at Franklin County, one of the things that I was able to do was get to a place where my colleagues were willing with me to ban that box on the application that asks whether there's a felony record. And that happened about 7 years ago. And when we did that, it was before other employers were doing that. It made a huge difference in our hiring practices, and we were able to hire staff who had justice involvement, and we did so. And when we did that, we offered supports that were asked for and needed for some of our staff. I would like to give one example. We had a staff that was hired in one of our departments, and he knew me from my work in reentry. came to me one day and asked if he could speak to me. And of course, I have an open door policy. And he came to me and he was very uncomfortable coming to me. And he said, Mrs. Brown, I've never had insurance. I've never had health insurance. I have been incarcerated for 30 years. I don't know what to do with this. And I just don't know who to talk to. I don't know what to do. And so, of course, that was something I didn't think about. Took him down to our human resources department myself, had him meet with somebody that I trusted, wanted them to go through the health insurance benefit so that he understood it. He then came back to my office about a month or two later. He had gone to a dentist for the first time, had not been to a dentist ever. I don't know if they ever saw a dentist where he was in prison. He came to me and gave me this big smile, and obviously he had not had dental work done in 30 years. It looked like when I first saw him. He was so proud of himself, and it was just an amazing thing. But that's not unusual for us at the county. We have many staff that I don't even know anymore how many have justice involvement, and that for me is a success. We don't need to know. We don't want to know. And we don't need to know. It's not an unusual occurrence that we have people in many positions that have had justice involvement, and that's great. It's wonderful. And we have made it okay for other employers in town to hire people with justice involvement, and they know it's okay. It's not scary. It's not that scary thing anymore. And it's worked. And we know that there are organizations, like there was a commenter earlier that owns Clean Turn, one of our many organizations in town that hire many people with justice involvement. They do a phenomenal job. There are many organizations in town that do great work, and they depend on hiring people who are great workers, great jobs, pay well, offer great benefits, and do the training and the support services that go along with that. And that is what it's about. You have to put supports around people when you offer training and people are coming out of incarceration. You need to put supports around them to make people feel like they're part of our community again. And that's great. But some of the people that we now hire are just incredible, and they don't need that support anymore because they've been out a while and had been having trouble finding positions. But they now know that we will hire them, and they're doing terrifically. So I'm just thrilled that we're able to do the things we are and have great employees that do outstanding work.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Brown and Councilmember Favor. We are 5 minutes from when we were supposed to be done, and we've got some phenomenal questions. We've got about 3 or so questions. I'm going to hopefully try to see if we can get these questions in, and then we will wrap up. So if we can be concise, but say what you need to say to answer the questions, because I do want to honor people's evenings, because some of y'all might be hungry. So I want to honor that. Okay, so this first question, thank you. Shout out to Leslie Schneider, who's asking this question. This one is directed to Mujeddid. This is also directed to Dr. Miller. And the question is, what would you both conceive of as an institutionalized path toward healing from racialized trauma for Black men?
I'm happy to jump in really quickly. I think that we have to. So I want to offer a systems level response to this, and then just open the door to Mr. Muhammad and his brilliance, which I've just greatly benefited from tonight and appreciate. But I would say all of our systems are oriented in such a way that we respond to Black men as risk. We respond to them as risk. We respond to them as danger. And so education does that. And so child welfare does that. Education hinges on notions of delinquents. Child welfare hinges on ideas of protections to try to prevent, children in this case from engaging in harm, the way we think about juvenile justice. And then as we go out, Black men are kind of are sort of a specter of fear. And so we respond to them in such a way, the way we do policing, all these things. And so I think that the response has to be, and so not to offer one institutionalized way to do it, but just sort of a kind of framework, is to think about people from high incarceration communities as folks who are vulnerable and in need of care. So we know that we've talked about trauma today. Trauma tracks with residential segregation, with wage and income based segregation, with the concentration of poverty and disadvantage. If we know that, then our responses have to reflect that. So we need spaces for people to be able to experience and share harms that they've caused, and we need responses that reflect those needs. The opposite of this would be the Supreme Court decision that just recently was handed down that decided that it's okay to put a child away forever. This is the opposite of the response that we need, and this isn't even really about compassion on some level. This is about recognizing the need that you're looking at. Am I looking at a response to pain and trauma? Am I looking at or am I looking at something else? And if I'm looking at a response to pain and trauma, I think my intervention should follow.
Mujeddid, before you speak, I know that we're going to be losing Councilmember Favor in just a second. I want to thank you for participating. I didn't know if there's any last word you said, and I'm going to put this question out here. You don't have to respond to this question because I know you got to go, but I want to make sure you hear the question so that if you have any follow-up, we can circle back around with you for any feedback you might have on this. And this came from Jamal Brown. Shout out to Jamal. Thank you so much for all you do in community. The question is, within Franklin County, how or to whom can we create avenues for pre-release and restored citizens? Is this an initiative that we may bridge with correctional systems and community partners? Does this become a division of our council, commissioners, Ohio Means Jobs, et cetera? What exemplars are out there that we can model? So I just wanted to make sure that we could hear this question. We may not be able to get to it in the interest of time, but Jamal, I wanted to make sure that our panel saw this. Maybe we can circle back to you, Councilmember Favor, to you, Commissioner Brown, and see on a local level how we can respond to this question that we're looking at on our screen. And thank you so much, Councilmember Favor. I know you got to go. We want to keep you on time. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for being here with us. All right, so hopefully, friends, we can get an answer to this question from our local leaders. So I'll make sure that we can try to follow up on this, Jamal, for you. And in the interest of time, this is our last question. And so I will ask this question, and Mujeddid, we're going to actually start with you in closing out with this question. Then we'll go to Commissioner Brown, and Dr. Miller, you will have the last word on this question. All right. So the question is this. One of the quotes that also sat with me, one of the last ones that I wrote that I heard in the book was, "I'm up against deep-rooted beliefs." This was in the book. I'm up against deep-rooted beliefs. So all of these things that have to be undone in order to make a more just system, in order for us to do a better job in in walking out and practicing this experiment of citizenship, of belongingness, that we've been speaking of. The question is this: what would be the radical, the ethical next right thing that we can do for restored citizenship and belongingness? And thinking about being ethical and being radical and the next right thing that we could do from your specific lens, what do you think that next right thing is that we can do for restored citizenship, their experience of citizenship and belongingness right here? Mujeddid, what are your thoughts?
Okay, so and I can touch on the other question that you had put out there as well.
As long as we do it slightly quickly, because I want to make sure people get to their dinner and their bedtimes.
Right, because I just couldn't pass that up, because it was a powerful question, first of all, right? But it brought to mind, one of the authors that I read was Neely Fuller. He wrote the compensatory code system back in the 80s, right? And in this book, one of his quotes was that if you don't understand white supremacy, what it is and how it works, everything else that you do understand will only confuse you, right? So when we talk about how do we change up a system that's saturated with those deep founded beliefs, that's what we first got to look at. Is I believe that's what the beliefs that Dr. Miller is talking about. And we all have to take a stance now. I was hopeful during one of the police killings that happened. I think it was the one in Minnesota. I don't know why I'm not thinking of his name right now. But when I was riding around anywhere in the city, right, I saw Blacks, I saw Mexicans out holding signs, saying this is enough. This got to come to an end. So what I'm saying we have to do is we all have to get involved. One of the things that Martin Luther King said a long time ago is that an injustice to any of us is a threat to justice everywhere, right? And now, because it's happening to us, Blacks, and it's a resurgence, right? It's beginning to affect us all everywhere, right? So I believe it starts with what Dr. Miller talked about, is that policy change. We have to change these policies. One thing that was said here, I wanted to speak with Commissioner Brown talked about, the taking the box, removing the box off the applications, right? And that's good. I definitely commend that. But how I've seen that work since I've been home is that, when you fill out an application, there's nothing on there to check anymore. But once you get considered for the job, they do a background check, right? And if that background check comes back, you could have gotten the job, but then they come back around and say, we're gonna have to let you go because your background came back, right? So it's all about, it's almost like they're going around the back door to do what you've taken away from going in the front door to do, right? So I think we have to have concrete policy changes, that are unequivocal about what their intent is to do to bring about the change that's needed.
Thank you so much, Mujeddid. And not just for answering that question, thank you much for just who you are and all that you do. We so appreciate
me.
How can we have a story and not have you?
And I definitely appreciate being able to be on this panel with Dr. Miller. I'm definitely going to get your book and read it. I love your train of thought, and what you're representing, and you're going to definitely be hearing from me in the future.
He's not playing. You will hear from him. All right, Commissioner Brown, the question is, in thinking about that statement that was in the book, I'm up against deep-rooted beliefs, how we break free from this. What is, regarding the radical, ethical, next right thing we can do for restored citizens so that they can experience citizenship and belongingness?
I truly believe it takes all of us, and it takes all of us speaking up, all of us working on this day in and day out. And as a member of the Jewish community, I have an extra maybe sensitivity to this issue of it being all of us, because I know that any kind of discrimination against any group, it could next be me. And it has been me and people like me. And I know that if any group is discriminated against, it's bad for our community, it's bad for the nation, and we can't have it. And we all must stand up against discrimination against anybody, any group. And it's necessary for a civil society to protect each other from discrimination. It's just as simple as that and as difficult as that. But it's necessary.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Brown. Thank you again, not just for being here on today, but for your many years of service to community. We are so grateful and so appreciative that you take this work very seriously and
Thank
personally,
you.
because it is personal. It is personal. Dr. Miller, we pulled you away from family and all the work, and maybe you're doing some research too. I don't know what you're doing over there, but you have the last word. And you doing the research, sitting with people, living this through your brother, living this through your father, living this through family, friends, and community, seeing story after story, sitting with folks, crying in spaces with you, walking with them while they try to find jobs, the whole experience for you, based on what you know, based on what you've written, what you study. What is the next radical, ethical, right thing that we can do for restored citizens to feel like we can better achieve this experiment of citizenship and belongingness?
So I'm going to stay a little bit abstract, but I think it has concrete implications, which is to make an ethical commitment. My dear friend Ronald Simpson Bay, whose ears burn every time I give a talk, which is quite often in the last since I released the book, and I'm grateful for that. Quite grateful. This has really just been the honor of my life, being here with you and being able to share my work with the broader audience. But what he says is that we have to change hearts and minds, and I always used to kind of smack, like, come on, man, hearts and minds. Like, we're talking about law and policy. We're not talking about hearts and minds, man. All this touchy-feely stuff. And then I realized that he's not talking about anything touchy-feely at all. What he's talking about is an ethical commitment that's borne out. And Ronald Simpson Bay can tell his own story, but what I'll tell you is that he did 27 years on a wrongful conviction. He lost a child while he was inside, and he advocated for the person who took his child's life. And he didn't do that because he loved the person who took his child's life. He did that because he made an ethical commitment that people, even people who've caused us great harm, deserve a place in the world because they're human beings. They're fully human participants in the human community. This is the kind of world that I want. I want the world that my brother Ronald Simpson Bay calls for. I want the kind of world that my brother Mr. Mujeddid Muhammad makes every day. A kind of world that Commissioner Brown and Commissioner Favor are trying to push us toward. A world in which people belong. And it requires an ethical commitment. It's not about how you feel in a given moment. It doesn't matter that you're afraid. So we may not solve racism tomorrow. In fact, I don't think that we will. And so whether or not you're afraid of my children, it doesn't matter. I want you to pretend like you're not and write law and policy as if they belonged in the world, as if you didn't have that fear. That comes from an ethical commitment where you move despite your fear because it's the right thing to do. That's what I want to leave us on. Since you gave me the last word, is that we make an ethical commitment one to another, a commitment to hospitality, a commitment to justice, a commitment to treating people we're afraid of as if they were people we loved and cared for.
Listen, family and friends out there, the doctor has spoken. The doctor's spoken. So listen, Thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you for being with us. Shout outs to all of the amazing, wonderful community partners that made this possible. Franklin County Office of Justice Policy, Central Ohio Restored Citizens Collaborative, ARCH, many other partners who do this work every day, day in and day out. Ohio Means Jobs. There are specific people who have labored, spent their own money, burnt their own time, had time away from their own families to make sure that they were meeting people at that Greyhound bus station, taking them to a counselor, making sure they got that driver's license. Thank you so much for all of you who remembered our family members when they were locked away and couldn't vote, who remembered that, you know what, let me put some money on your books, who remembered to call or to write a letter, who remembered that the families and friends do time when their loved one is locked away, who remember that sometimes you serve more time outside than you do inside based on the stigma of reentering. Thank you so much for everyone out there who cares about this work, who tuned in. Thank you to you, Dr. Miller, for writing that book. We are making sure it gets into folks' hands, and we're hoping that that book changes hearts and minds so that we have other leaders who care about this, right? Sometimes at the end of the day, it's about more than the pieces of paper, right? We need people to give a damn, you know, so that they can go and do the good work. Go do the good work. So thank you so much, family and friends out there in YouTube world and Facebook world. Thank you to you, Mujeddid Muhammad. Thank you to you, Commissioner Brown. Thank you to you, Dr. Miller. And that's it, friends and family. God bless and good night. Enjoy the rest of your evening and go be good to somebody who needs to know that there's life after trauma. You don't just survive it. You can thrive and you can be resilient. Go help people.
And thank you to you, Kim. This was a beautiful job. You facilitated this thing to the core. Thank you.
I appreciate you. I appreciate you. All right, people. Be well.
Be well.